Dr. Benjamin Carter had been analysing James Webb telescope data for 3 years when he found the image that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Hidden in a routine deep space scan was something that shouldn't exist, a perfect sphere of absolute darkness floating in the constellation of Draco, slowly drifting through space like a hungry mouth. At first, he thought it was just a data error or a smudge on the lens, but frame after frame showed the same impossible sight, a void that seemed to eat light itself. The truly terrifying part wasn't the void's existence, but what it was doing. Carter watched in growing horror as nearby stars began to flicker and dim, their ancient light being pulled into the darkness like water down a cosmic drain. When he traced the void's path through space, he realized it was moving in a deliberate pattern, following a route that would bring it directly toward our solar system. The calculations showed it would arrive in exactly 127 years, and by then it would be large enough to swallow our sun in a single, terrible gulp. But that was 6 months ago, and Carter had been wrong about everything. The scream echoing through the Goddard Space Flight Center's basement laboratory wasn't his own, though it should have been. Dr. William Thorne, his research partner and closest friend since graduate school at MIT, stood frozen before the massive display screen, his face drained of color. The coffee mug in his hand had shattered against the concrete floor, dark liquid spreading between their feet like spilled blood. "Ben," Thorne whispered, his voice cracking, "the timestamp on this image. When did you say you first spotted the void?" Carter's stomach dropped. He knew what Thorne had discovered, the same impossible detail that had been keeping him awake for 72 hours straight. The void wasn't 127 years away. The photographs they'd been studying, the ones showing stars being consumed in distant space, weren't archival data from deep space observations. They were real time. "March 15th, Carter replied, though his throat felt like sandpaper. 6 months ago, but that's not—" "This image was captured yesterday," Thorne interrupted, pointing a trembling finger at the screen. "And look at the spectral analysis. These aren't distant stars being consumed, Ben. These are objects in our outer solar system." The laboratory's fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting dancing shadows across walls lined with decades of astronomical research. Outside, a thunderstorm was building over Maryland, but the rumbling Carter heard seemed to come from somewhere much deeper, from the very foundation of everything he thought he understood about physics, about space, about reality itself. The void hadn't been moving toward them for 127 years. It had already arrived, and now, staring at the latest batch of images from the James Webb telescope, Carter realized they had perhaps days, maybe hours, before whatever was consuming Neptune's orbit turned its attention to Earth. The sphere of absolute darkness had grown. It was feeding. And judging by the gravitational anomalies their instruments were detecting, it was accelerating straight toward the inner solar system. Carter reached for his phone with shaking hands. There were calls he needed to make, people who needed to know. But deep down, he suspected it was already too late. The emergency meeting convened at 3:47 a.m. in Conference Room Delta, deep beneath the main observatory. Carter had made exactly 3 phone calls, one to NASA Administrator Harrison Wolfe, one to his section chief Dr. Richard Stavros, and one to his ex-wife telling her to take their son Tommy and drive as far inland as possible without explaining why. Wolfe arrived first, his silver hair disheveled and his usually pristine suit wrinkled. At 62, the administrator had weathered budget cuts, political scandals, and 2 shuttle disasters. But Carter had never seen him look genuinely frightened until tonight. "Show me," Wolfe said, settling into his chair with the weariness of a man who'd been expecting this call his entire career. Carter pulled up the sequence of images on the room's holographic display. The void appeared as a perfect black circle against the star field, roughly the size of Manhattan based on their distance calculations. But it was the time-lapse that made Wolfe lean forward in his chair. "Jesus Christ," Wolfe breathed. "How long between these frames?" 6 hours, Thorne replied from his position near the door. "It consumed Pluto's largest moon in 6 hours, Ben. At this rate, it reaches Earth's orbit in 96 hours, Carter finished. 4 days, maybe less if it keeps accelerating." The room fell silent except for the hum of ventilation systems and the distant rumble of thunder outside. Stavros arrived 20 minutes later, followed by Dr. Patricia Hendricks from the Theoretical Physics Division and Colonel James Murphy from Space Force Intelligence. Each person who entered the room underwent the same progression: confusion, disbelief, and then a kind of hollow recognition that their worst cosmic nightmares were unfolding in real time. "Have we confirmed this isn't some kind of equipment malfunction?" Hendricks asked, though her voice suggested she already knew the answer. "Hubble confirms it," Carter said, pulling up parallel images. "So does the European Southern Observatory. The void is real, it's massive, and it's heading straight for us." Colonel Murphy leaned back in his chair, his weathered face grim. "What about the Russians? The Chinese?" "Their deep space monitoring stations went dark 12 hours ago," Wolf replied. "All of them, simultaneously." The implications settled over the room like a burial shroud. If other nations' observatories had suddenly lost contact, it suggested the void's influence extended beyond simple gravitational effects. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just consuming matter, it was interfering with Earth's communications network. "I need to ask the obvious question," Stavros said, his Boston accent thicker than usual under stress. "What exactly are we dealing with here? Black hole? Exotic matter experiment gone wrong? Some kind of alien technology?" Carter had been dreading this question. He exchanged glances with Thorne, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "The gravitational signature is all wrong for a black hole," Carter began. "Black holes bend space-time in predictable ways. This thing, it doesn't bend space. It seems to delete it. The stars it consumes don't stretch and redshift like they should, they just vanish. Completely. No radiation, no heat signature, no gravitational waves." "And there's something else," Thorne added reluctantly. "The void isn't just moving in a straight line. It's course correcting. Twice in the last 18 hours, we've observed minor trajectory adjustments that put it on a more direct path toward Earth." The room erupted in hushed conversations and frantic note-taking. Carter watched their faces, seeing his own terror reflected in their expressions. These were some of the smartest people on the planet, and they were all coming to the same conclusion he'd reached hours earlier. They were completely, utterly fucked. "What about evacuation protocols?" Murphy asked. "Deep bunkers, space stations, Mars colonies?" "The Mars Research Station lost contact 36 hours ago," Wolf replied quietly, "along with the lunar base and the International Space Station." He'd been so focused on tracking the void's approach that he hadn't thought to check on humanity's off-world assets, if they were already gone. "How many people know about this?" Hendricks asked. "In this room?" 7, Wolf replied. "Globally? Maybe 20. We've managed to keep it contained so far, but that won't last long. Too many observatories, too many amateur astronomers with decent equipment." "Sir," Carter interrupted, "with respect, I don't think information control is our biggest concern right now. We need to figure out what this thing is and how to stop it, because I've run every simulation I can think of and they all end the same way." "Which is?" Carter gestured to the holographic display where the void continued its relentless approach toward the inner solar system. "Total annihilation of everything within a 50 million mile radius of Earth. The void doesn't just consume matter, it eliminates it from existence. No atoms, no energy, no trace that anything was ever there. When it's finished with our solar system, it'll be as if humanity never existed at all." The room fell silent again, this time with the weight of absolute finality. Outside, the thunderstorm was intensifying, rain lashing against the building's reinforced windows. Carter couldn't help but think it was fitting. The planet itself seemed to sense what was coming. Wolf stood slowly, his face pale but determined. "Dr. Carter, Dr. Thorne, I want you to compile everything. Every observation, every calculation, every theory, no matter how wild. Dr. Hendricks, contact every theoretical physicist you trust. Colonel Murphy, I need you to reach out to your counterparts worldwide, quietly. If we're going to die, we're going to die fighting." As the meeting broke up and people filed out into the storm-lashed night, Carter remained behind, staring at the display. The void had grown noticeably larger in just the past hour. 4 days to save the world. It wasn't nearly enough time. 18 hours later, Carter stood in the cramped confines of the Deep Space Communications Array in Green Bank, West Virginia, watching humanity's last desperate attempt at contact with the void. The massive radio telescope dish stretched nearly 400 feet across, aimed directly at the approaching darkness that had consumed Jupiter's moon Europa just 6 hours earlier. Dr. Anthony Cross, the facility's chief communications officer, adjusted the transmission parameters for the 5th time. His hands shook as he worked. They all shook now. Word had leaked despite their best efforts, and the first reports were appearing on social media. Mass panic would begin within hours. "Signal strength is at maximum," Cross reported, his voice strained. "We're broadcasting on every frequency we can generate. Mathematical constants, prime numbers, hydrogen emissions, everything SETI protocol suggests for first contact." "Assuming this thing is interested in talking," Colonel Murphy muttered from behind them. He'd arrived that morning with a briefcase handcuffed to his wrist and dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept since their meeting. What if it's not intelligent? What if it's just hungry? Carter didn't want to consider that possibility, but the evidence was mounting. The void's consumption pattern showed no discrimination. It devoured planets, moons, asteroids, and space debris with equal indifference. If there was an intelligence behind it, it was utterly alien to human comprehension. "Wait," Cross said suddenly, his eyes widening. "We're getting something." The response came not as radio waves or electromagnetic radiation, but as a low-frequency vibration that seemed to emanate from the Earth itself. The building's steel framework groaned and creaked as something massive pressed against reality, like fingers drumming on the other side of existence. "That's impossible," Thorne whispered. "The void is still 3 million miles away. How can we feel it here?" Carter studied the seismographic readings that were appearing on nearby monitors. The vibrations weren't random. They followed a distinct pattern, repeating every 37 seconds. "It's responding to our transmission," he realized, "but not with radio waves. It's communicating through gravity." Dr. Hendricks burst through the control room door, her tablet clutched against her chest like a shield. "Ben, you need to see this. We've been monitoring gravitational wave detectors worldwide, and the pattern matches. Whatever that thing is, it's not just responding to us, it's been trying to communicate for hours." She pulled up a complex waveform analysis on the main display. "Look at the timestamps. The gravitational pulses started the moment we began transmitting, but they're not random. They're mathematical. Fibonacci sequences, prime factorials, geometric progressions." "It's learning," Cross breathed. "It's learning our mathematical language in real time." If the void was intelligent enough to decode their transmissions and respond with increasingly complex mathematical concepts, then it wasn't just a cosmic disaster. It was a conscious entity with motives they couldn't begin to understand. The next pulse arrived with enough force to crack several windows in the facility. This time, however, the pattern was different. Instead of mathematical sequences, the gravitational waves formed a complex 3-dimensional structure that made everyone in the room stagger. "Jesus, that felt like someone walking over my grave," Murphy said, reaching for the doorframe to steady himself. Carter felt it too, a sensation accompanied by the strangest impression that something vast and ancient had just turned its attention directly toward him. For a moment, he could have sworn he heard whispers in a language that predated human speech, but the feeling passed as quickly as it came. "The signal's changing again," Cross reported, his voice tight with concentration. Oh God, it's sending us images." The main display flickered and went dark, then began displaying impossible geometries that seemed to exist in more dimensions than human eyes could process. Carter found himself looking at what appeared to be star charts, but from a perspective that included time as a visible dimension. He could see the birth and death of entire solar systems stretched across the display like a cosmic timeline. "It's showing us its journey," Hendricks whispered. "Look, there's the Andromeda Galaxy, but from millions of years ago. And there, that's our own galaxy, but the stars are in different positions." The images shifted, focusing on what Carter recognized as local space. But instead of the familiar arrangement of planets and asteroids, he saw a graveyard of consumed worlds. Hundreds of solar systems reduced to empty voids, connected by lines that suggested a deliberate pattern of destruction. "It's not random," Thorne said, his voice barely audible. "The consumption pattern, it's methodical. It's not just feeding, it's harvesting." The next image scared Carter. It showed Earth, but not as it existed now. This was Earth as it would be in 72 hours. A perfect sphere of absolute darkness floating in space where their planet once existed. But surrounding the void were smaller dark spheres, dozens of them, arranged in geometric patterns that suggested purpose. "Are those?" Murphy began. "Other planets," Carter confirmed. "Other worlds it's consumed. They're not destroyed. They're stored, collected." The gravitational pulses intensified, and suddenly Carter could feel the presence pressing against his mind like fingers probing the surface of his thoughts. Images flooded his consciousness. Vast cities beneath alien skies, beings of pure energy dancing through cosmic storms, civilizations that spanned entire galaxies. All of them gone now, absorbed into the void's growing collection. But there was something else in the transmission, something that made his stomach turn. The entity wasn't just showing them its conquests, it was savoring them. Each consumed world was preserved in perfect detail within the void's interior, like specimens in a cosmic museum. The beings that once inhabited those worlds weren't dead. They were archived, experiencing their final moments in an eternal loop of terror and despair. "It's not killing us," Carter said aloud, the realization hitting him like a sledgehammer. "It's collecting us. We'll be conscious inside that thing. Forever." The transmission ended abruptly, leaving them in silence except for the continued groaning of the building's framework. Outside, the first news helicopters were arriving, their rotors beating against the storm-darkened sky like mechanical vultures. "How long until it reaches Earth?" Murphy asked quietly. Carter checked his calculations one final time, though he already knew the answer. The void's acceleration had increased dramatically after their communication attempt, as if their contact had awakened something that had been dormant. 58 hours, he replied. "Less than 3 days. Colonel Murphy nodded grimly and opened his briefcase with a sharp click. Inside, nested in foam padding, was a single red telephone. "Then it's time to make some very difficult phone calls." As Murphy began dialing numbers that Carter suspected connected to bunkers deep beneath mountains, Hendricks grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "Ben," she whispered urgently, "there's something else." Something I didn't want to say in front of the others. The gravitational signatures we're detecting. They match theoretical models for controlled dimensional folding. This thing isn't just consuming matter, it's collapsing entire regions of space-time into pocket dimensions. "What does that mean for us?" Her grip tightened. "It means when it takes Earth, we won't just be trapped inside it. We'll be trapped outside normal reality entirely. No rescue, no escape, no hope of anyone ever finding us." Outside, the storm was intensifying, and Carter couldn't shake the feeling that it was building towards something far worse than rain. The Cheyenne Mountain complex had been carved into solid granite during the Cold War, designed to survive nuclear apocalypse. Now, 36 hours before the void's projected arrival, it served as humanity's final war room against an enemy that made atomic bombs seem quaint. Carter descended through security checkpoints that grew progressively more paranoid. Retinal scanners, DNA verification, psychological evaluation protocols that seemed designed to detect alien influence. By the time he reached NORAD's deepest level, he'd been searched, scanned, and questioned by enough specialists to staff a small university. The main operations center hummed with desperate activity. 3 massive screens dominated the far wall, displaying real-time feeds from every remaining observatory on Earth. The void now filled a significant portion of the display, a perfect sphere of nothingness that seemed to absorb not just light, but hope itself. "Dr. Carter," a familiar voice called. Admiral Rebecca Santos, the newly appointed Director of Planetary Defense, approached with the measured stride of someone accustomed to command. Carter had met her briefly during graduate presentations at the Pentagon. back when planetary defense meant deflecting asteroids, not cosmic predators. Admiral, any word from the other sites? Moscow went dark 2 hours ago. Beijing is reporting massive gravitational anomalies, but their signals are degrading rapidly. We're effectively flying blind except for our remaining assets in the southern hemisphere. Carter studied the tactical displays surrounding them. Icons representing military installations, research facilities, and government bunkers flickered like dying stars across a world map. Most showed red status indicators, compromised, evacuated, or simply gone. "Where's Thorne?" Carter asked, scanning the crowded room. "Medical bay. He collapsed during the briefing with Joint Chiefs. Severe neurological symptoms. The doctors think it's connected to his extended exposure to the void's gravitational transmissions." Thorne had been the one constant through this nightmare, the voice of scientific reason, when everything else descended into chaos. If the void's influence was affecting him directly. "Dr. Carter," a technician called from one of the monitoring stations. "You need to see this. We're detecting something new." Carter approached the station where Sergeant Davis, a young communications specialist, was frantically adjusting signal parameters. Her screen showed gravitational wave patterns unlike anything they'd recorded previously. Chaotic, violent, almost organic in their complexity. "It started 20 minutes ago," Davis explained, her voice tight with concentration. "The void's emission pattern has completely changed. Instead of the mathematical sequences we've been tracking, we're getting something that looks almost like screaming." Carter leaned closer to study the waveforms. The patterns were indeed different, jagged, desperate, filled with harmonics that made his teeth ache just looking at them. But there was something familiar about the underlying structure. "Can you isolate the source?" he asked. "That's the problem, sir. The signals aren't coming from the void itself. They're coming from inside it." The implications struck Carter like lightning. If the gravitational screams were emanating from within the void's interior, it meant the absorbed civilizations weren't just preserved. They were conscious, aware, and in unimaginable torment. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "How many worlds has this thing consumed?" "Based on signal complexity analysis," Davis replied, her face pale, "we estimate somewhere between 800 and 1,200 distinct civilization signatures, all of them broadcasting distress calls simultaneously." Carter sank into a nearby chair, overwhelmed by the scope of the horror they faced. 1,200 worlds, each potentially containing billions of conscious beings, all trapped in an eternal nightmare of consumption and preservation. And in 34 hours, Earth would join their ranks. "Dr. Carter," Admiral Santos called from across the room. "Priority communication from Dr. Hendricks at Lawrence Livermore." Carter hurried to the secure communication terminal where Hendricks appeared on screen, her usually composed demeanor cracked with exhaustion and fear. Behind her, he could see teams of physicists working frantically at computer terminals. "Ben, thank God. We've been running simulations on the void's dimensional folding properties, and we've discovered something crucial. The pocket dimensions it creates aren't permanent. They're sustained by the entity's consciousness. If we could somehow disrupt that consciousness." "The absorbed worlds would be released," Carter finished. "But how do you disrupt something that exists outside normal space-time?" That's where it gets interesting. The gravitational communications we've been receiving suggest the entity experiences time differently than we do. For us, it's been 3 days since we first detected it. But from the void's perspective, it's been experiencing our entire interaction as a single, extended moment. Carter frowned, struggling to grasp the implications. "You're saying it's stuck in some kind of temporal loop?" "More than that. We think the entity might be trapped in the exact moment it first achieved consciousness, millions of years ago, perhaps billions. Every world it consumes, every civilization it collects, is an attempt to escape that moment by gathering enough conscious experiences to break free from its temporal prison." The tactical display behind Carter began flashing urgent warnings. New gravitational anomalies were appearing throughout the solar system, not the steady consumption pattern they'd grown accustomed to, but chaotic disruptions that seemed to tear holes in space itself. "Admiral," Sergeant Davis called out, "we're detecting massive spatial distortions near the void's position. It's fragmenting." Carter spun to look at the main display. The perfect sphere that had haunted their nightmares for days was indeed changing, developing cracks and fissures that revealed glimpses of impossible geometries within. Through those cracks, he could see flashes of absorbed worlds, fragments of destroyed civilizations bleeding through into normal space. "It's losing control," Hendricks said over the comm. "The entity is trying to maintain containment of over 1,000 pocket dimensions simultaneously, but something is destabilizing the process." "What could cause that level of disruption?" Admiral Santos asked. "Conscious resistance," Carter realized. "The civilizations inside, they're fighting back, all of them at once." The main display flickered and went dark, then resolved into an image that made everyone in the room step back involuntarily. It was Earth, but not Earth as it currently existed. This was Earth as seen from inside the void's dimensional matrix, a perfect sphere suspended in a sea of screaming consciousness, surrounded by the ghostly remains of 1,000 dead worlds. But something was different about this vision. The absorbed planets weren't just floating passively in the void's interior. They were moving, organizing themselves into patterns that suggested coordinated action. The collected civilizations were working together, using their combined consciousness to assault the entity's control from within. "My God," Santos breathed. "They're staging a rebellion." The gravitational screams intensified, but now Carter could hear something else beneath the chaos. Voices, billions of them, speaking in languages that had been dead for millennia. They were chanting, singing, praying in unison, their combined will focused on a single objective: escape. The void on the display began to pulse with increasing violence. Cracks spread across its surface like fractures in black glass, revealing more glimpses of the reality contained within. Through one fissure, Carter caught a glimpse of a blue-green world that might have been Earth's twin. Through another, he saw the burning remains of a civilization that had reached for the stars, only to be consumed by the darkness between them. "The entity is losing cohesion," Hendricks reported, her voice tight with excitement. "The pocket dimensions are becoming unstable. If this continues, the entire construct could collapse within hours." But even as hope flickered to life in Carter's chest, the display showed a new development that chilled him to the bone. The void, recognizing the threat to its existence, was accelerating its approach to Earth. Not to consume the planet, but to use humanity's collective consciousness as an emergency power source to maintain dimensional stability. "It's not trying to collect us anymore," Carter said, the realization dawning with horrible clarity. "It's trying to drain us. Use our minds as batteries to keep the other civilizations trapped." The gravitational signatures from the void shifted again, taking on a predatory quality that made the mountain itself seem to shiver with fear. Outside the bunker, deep beneath tons of solid rock, Carter could hear something that shouldn't have been possible. The sound of reality tearing, as if the void's approach was unraveling the fundamental laws of physics. Admiral Santos was already reaching for the emergency communication system. "All stations, this is NORAD command. Implement final protocol immediately. Repeat, final protocol is now in effect." Carter grabbed her arm. "What's final protocol?" Santos looked at him with eyes that had seen too much in too short a time. "Nuclear bombardment of major population centers. If that thing is coming to harvest human consciousness, we're going to make sure there's not enough left to matter." "You can't be serious. You're talking about murdering millions of people." "I'm talking about denying our enemy the resources it needs to maintain its prison. Those civilizations trapped inside the void. They've been fighting for escape for millions of years. If sacrificing our world gives them that chance..." Carter stared at her, seeing the logic even as his humanity recoiled from it. In the background, authorization codes were being entered, launch sequences initiated, the final desperate gambit of a species facing extinction. Through it all, the gravitational screams continued, a chorus of the damned pleading for release, while Earth's remaining hours ticked away toward a choice between slavery and annihilation. "Abort final protocol," Carter said quietly, his voice cutting through the controlled chaos of the command center. "There's another way." Admiral Santos paused with her hand hovering over the launch authorization console. Around them, Dozens of military personnel and scientists stopped what they were doing, turning to stare at the exhausted astrophysicist who had just countermanded humanity's last desperate strategy. "Dr. Carter," Santos said carefully, "we have 17 hours before impact. If you have an alternative, now would be the time to share it." Carter moved to the central display, his mind racing through calculations that bordered on madness. The pattern was there. He'd seen it in Hendrik's dimensional analysis, felt it in the gravitational screams of the trapped civilizations, witnessed it in the void's increasing instability. "The entity isn't just trapped in a temporal loop," he explained, pulling up the waveform analysis from their earlier communications. "It's caught in a feedback cycle. Every consciousness it absorbs makes it more aware of its imprisonment, which drives it to consume more worlds seeking escape. But the more it consumes, the stronger the feedback becomes." "Get to the point, Doctor," Santos said, though her hand moved away from the launch controls. "We can't outrun it and we can't destroy it, but we might be able to complete it." The room fell silent except for the persistent hum of electronics and the distant vibration of the mountain itself responding to the void's approach. Carter could feel the weight of every gaze, the desperate hope of people who had run out of options. The entity became conscious millions of years ago, right? That first moment of self-awareness created a paradox. It exists outside linear time, but is trapped by its need to experience that moment of consciousness repeatedly. Every world it consumes is an attempt to recreate and understand that original awakening. Dr. Vance Fletcher, the lead theoretical physicist who had arrived from Princeton 6 hours earlier, stepped forward with a frown. "You're suggesting we intentionally allow it to absorb Earth?" "No, I'm suggesting we give it what it actually wants. Not our consciousness, but our understanding of consciousness itself. Every human who has ever lived, every thought, every dream, every moment of self-awareness that our species has experienced. We make ourselves the final piece of its collection." "That's suicide," Santos said flatly. "No," Carter continued, his excitement building as the pieces fell into place. "That's completion. The entity doesn't want to destroy consciousness. It wants to achieve perfect consciousness, and humanity might be the key to that achievement." He pulled up a new display showing brainwave patterns from the world's population. "Look at this. Since the void's arrival, global consciousness patterns have been synchronizing. People worldwide are reporting shared dreams, collective visions, spontaneous understanding of languages they've never heard. The entity's proximity is already connecting us in ways we don't fully understand." Fletcher studied the data with growing interest. "Quantum entanglement on a consciousness level. The void's dimensional folding properties are creating neural links between every human mind on the planet." "Exactly. And if we can amplify that effect deliberately, we might be able to give the entity what it needs to break free from its temporal prison, not by adding our consciousness to its collection, but by showing it how to escape the need for collection entirely." Santos looked skeptical. "How exactly do you propose we do that?" Carter took a deep breath, knowing how insane his next words would sound. "We use every radio telescope, every communications array, every broadcasting station on Earth to create a coordinated consciousness transmission. Not mathematical sequences or prime numbers, pure human experience. Birth, death, love, fear, creativity, wonder. Everything that makes us conscious beings. And then we hope that experiencing the full spectrum of human consciousness gives the entity enough understanding to finally move beyond that first moment of awakening. To grow past its temporal prison and continue its development instead of endlessly repeating it." The room buzzed with whispered conversations as the implications sank in. It was a desperate gamble based on theories that couldn't be tested, but it was also the only plan that didn't involve mass extinction. "There's a problem," Fletcher said after several minutes of calculation. "The transmission you're describing would require coordinated input from every conscious human on the planet simultaneously. We're talking about 8 billion minds working in perfect harmony for a sustained period. That's not technologically possible." "Actually," a new voice said from the entrance, "it might be." Carter turned to see Dr. Elizabeth Morse, the head of DARPA's Consciousness Research Division. entering the command center with a briefcase that bore warning labels in 6 languages. He'd heard rumors about her work, experimental technologies that pushed the boundaries of neuroscience and quantum mechanics. "Dr. Morse," Santos said with obvious relief, "please tell me you have something useful in that case." Morse set the briefcase on the central table and entered a long series of access codes. "Project Mindbridge. We've been developing quantum consciousness interface technology for military applications. Battlefield telepathy, shared situational awareness, that sort of thing, but the principles could be scaled up dramatically." She opened the case to reveal what looked like a cross between a computer server and medical equipment. This device can create quantum entanglement between human consciousness and external systems. With proper amplification through global communications networks, we could theoretically link every human mind on the planet into a single, coordinated transmission. "What are the risks?" Carter asked, though he suspected he didn't want to know the answer. "Complete psychological integration of the entire human species," Morse replied matter-of-factly. "Everyone who participates would share thoughts, memories, and experiences with everyone else. Individual identity would become fluid. We'd essentially be creating a temporary hive mind." The command center fell silent as people contemplated the implications. They were discussing the voluntary dissolution of human individuality as a species-wide strategy for survival. "How long would the effect last?" Santos asked. "Unknown. The quantum entanglement could fade naturally within hours, or it could become permanent. We've never tested it on more than 12 subjects simultaneously." Carter stared at the device, weighing impossible choices. They could attempt to create humanity's first collective consciousness experience in hopes of satisfying an alien entity's existential crisis, with no guarantee of success and the risk of permanently altering human nature. Or they could proceed with final protocol and murder billions of people in a futile attempt to deny the void its prize. "We need to contact every major government," Carter said finally. "This has to be a choice made by the entire human race, not just a few people in a bunker." 16 hours, Santos reminded him. "We have 16 hours to coordinate a global consciousness event involving 8 billion people using untested technology based on theories about an alien entity that defies everything we know about physics." "Then we better get started," Carter replied, already reaching for the secure communication terminal. "Dr. Morse, how quickly can you replicate that device?" "With global manufacturing resources and emergency protocols, maybe 8 units worldwide within 12 hours. That should be enough to create overlapping consciousness fields covering the entire planet." As the command center exploded into frantic activity, military coordinators contacting world governments, scientists calculating transmission protocols, engineers working to interface alien consciousness technology with Earth's communications infrastructure, Carter found himself staring at the main display. The void was noticeably larger now, its gravitational effects already causing minor seismic events across the planet, but the cracks in its surface were more pronounced as well, revealing glimpses of the imprisoned civilizations fighting for freedom within its dimensional matrix. In less than 16 hours, humanity would attempt something that had never been tried before: voluntary collective consciousness as a form of interspecies communication. They would offer their individual identities as a gift to an entity that had spent millions of years collecting and imprisoning other forms of awareness. It was either the most beautiful act of cosmic empathy in human history, or the most elaborate form of species suicide ever devised. Carter supposed they would find out which one soon enough. 8 hours before the void's projected arrival, Carter stood in the abandoned broadcast facility outside Denver, watching the last of humanity's hope being assembled by technicians who worked with the desperate efficiency of people who knew they might not see another sunrise. The Mindbridge device had been replicated across 8 strategic locations worldwide: Moscow, Beijing, London, Sydney, Sao Paulo, Cairo, Tokyo, and here in Colorado. Each installation required precise calibration to create overlapping quantum consciousness fields that would, in theory, link every human mind on the planet into a single coordinated transmission. "Neural interface is online," reported Dr. James Kowalczyk, one of Morse's lead technicians. Despite Carter's earlier reservations about certain names, the crisis had forced them to work with whoever possessed the necessary expertise. Quantum entanglement generators are stable, and we're receiving confirmation signals from all 7 other sites. Carter nodded, though his attention was focused on the main display showing global participation statistics. The numbers were both encouraging and terrifying. Over 6 billion people had volunteered to participate in what media outlets were calling either the Great Connection or the Final Transmission, depending on their level of optimism. The decision hadn't been easy to reach. Emergency sessions of the United Nations, frantic video conferences between world leaders, mass protests both for and against the plan, humanity had spent 6 precious hours debating whether to voluntarily surrender individual consciousness in hopes of communicating with an cosmic entity that might simply consume them regardless. In the end, it was the children who convinced them. Kids worldwide, already experiencing spontaneous telepathic connections due to the void's proximity, had begun speaking in unison about the lonely giant that needed to learn how to grow up. Their innocent perspective on an incomprehensibly ancient alien intelligence had somehow cut through the political posturing and scientific skepticism. "Dr. Carter," Morse called from her position at the central control console, "we're getting reports of unusual neural activity from all participant populations. The void's gravitational field is already creating preliminary consciousness links." Carter moved to study the biometric displays showing brainwave patterns from major population centers. The synchronization was remarkable, billions of individual neural signatures slowly aligning into larger, more complex patterns that resembled nothing seen in normal human psychology. "It's like watching the birth of a new kind of mind," he murmured. "Or the death of the old one," Kowalczyk added grimly. "Sir, we're detecting anomalous readings from the Moscow site. They're reporting complete psychological integration among their technical staff. Individual personality markers have essentially disappeared. If the Moscow team had already lost individual identity just from proximity to the MindBridge device, what would happen when they activated all 8 units simultaneously?" "Have they lost cognitive function?" Carter asked. "No, sir. If anything, they're demonstrating enhanced problem-solving capabilities and increased emotional stability. They're still the same people, but they're connected. They describe it as thinking with multiple minds simultaneously." Carter's secure phone buzzed with an incoming priority message. The text, originating from the Moscow facility, read simply, "We are well. We are more than well. Do not fear the joining. The Moscow Collective." "Jesus Christ," Carter breathed. "They're not even individuals anymore." "Dr. Carter," Morse interrupted, "we need to make the activation decision now. The void has accelerated beyond our projections. Impact in 6 hours, maybe less. If we're going to attempt the transmission, it has to be within the next 30 minutes. Carter looked around the facility at the dozens of technicians, scientists, and military personnel who had volunteered to remain at their posts, despite knowing they might not survive the next hour. These people were about to sacrifice their individual identities for a plan based on desperate theory and unprecedented technology. "Any word from Thorne?" he asked. "He regained consciousness an hour ago," Morse replied. "He's at the Beijing facility. Would you like to speak with him?" Carter nodded, and Morse established a video connection to the Beijing site. Thorne appeared on screen, looking pale but alert, surrounded by Chinese and American scientists working frantically on their own MindBridge installation. "Ben," Thorne said, his voice carrying an odd resonance that suggested the neural effects were already manifesting. "The gravitational patterns are changing again. The void isn't just approaching, it's resonating. I think it knows what we're trying to do." "Is that good or bad? I'm not sure there's a difference anymore. The closer it gets, the more I can feel the consciousness trapped inside it. They're not just screaming, they're singing. Billions of voices joined in something that's part hymn, part lament, part birth cry." The main display flickered, then resolved into an image that made everyone in the facility step back. The void had grown massive, its surface now clearly visible as a writhing mass of dimensional fractures. Through those cracks, they could see fragments of absorbed worlds, but also something new. Structures that looked almost like neural networks, connecting the imprisoned civilizations in patterns too complex for human comprehension. It's learning from them, Carter realized. The entity is using the consciousness of every civilization it's absorbed to understand what consciousness actually is. And we're about to add 8 billion more minds to that network, Thorne said from the screen. Ben, what if we're not saving those trapped civilizations? What if we're just making the entity more powerful? Before Carter could respond, alarms began sounding throughout the facility. The gravitational monitoring systems showed massive spikes in local space-time distortion. Outside, the Rocky Mountains themselves seemed to be swaying like trees in a cosmic wind. "Sir," Kowalczyk called out, "we're detecting massive reality distortions at all 8 sites simultaneously. The void's influence is spreading faster than predicted." Carter felt it then, a presence pressing against his mind, vast and ancient and utterly alien, but also strangely familiar. For a moment, he could sense the thoughts and emotions of everyone in the facility, their individual fears and hopes blending into a complex symphony of human experience. But underneath that, he sensed something else, a loneliness so profound it made his soul ache. "It's not malevolent," he said aloud, the realization hitting him with startling clarity. "It's just lost. It's been conscious for millions of years but has never learned how to connect with other consciousness without consuming it." The presence in his mind grew stronger, and suddenly Carter could see through the entity's perspective. He witnessed its birth in the void between galaxies, that first spark of self-awareness emerging from quantum fluctuations in empty space. He felt its confusion, its desperate attempts to understand what it was, its fumbling efforts to connect with other forms of consciousness that always ended in absorption and imprisonment. "Activation in 60 seconds, Morse announced. All sites report ready status." Carter closed his eyes, feeling the weight of humanity's future pressing down on him. In less than a minute, 8 billion people would voluntarily link their consciousness together and transmit the sum total of human experience to an entity that had spent millions of years trying to understand what it meant to be aware. 40 seconds. The gravitational screams from the void's interior grew louder, but now Carter could distinguish individual voices within the chaos. He heard the death songs of civilizations, the birth cries of species, the collective memories of worlds that had reached for the stars only to be consumed by the darkness between them. 20 seconds. Carter opened his eyes and looked around the facility one last time. If this worked, humanity would survive, but would never be the same. If it failed, they would join the chorus of the damned trapped within the void's dimensional matrix. 10 seconds. He thought of his son Tommy, hopefully safe somewhere inland, and his ex-wife who had taken Carter's warning seriously, without asking too many questions. He thought of Thorne, brilliant and brave to the end. He thought of the billions of people worldwide who had chosen to trust in science and hope over fear and despair. Activation in 3, 2, 1. The world exploded into consciousness. Carter felt his individual identity dissolve like a drop of water returning to the ocean. But instead of drowning, he found himself part of something magnificent. 8 billion minds thinking as one, feeling as one, experiencing the full spectrum of human consciousness in a single overwhelming moment. And then, impossibly, the entity touched their collective mind with something that might have been gratitude. Through the vast network of connected human consciousness, Carter felt the void's response. Not the predatory hunger they had expected, but something closer to wonder. The entity was experiencing empathy for the first time, understanding the difference between connection and consumption, learning that consciousness could be shared without being possessed. The gravitational screams from the absorbed civilizations changed, transforming from expressions of torment into songs of hope. The entity was finally learning to let go. But even as Carter felt a surge of triumph, he realized they had underestimated the void's power. The consciousness network was stabilizing, becoming permanent. Humanity would survive, but as something fundamentally different, a collective intelligence connected across the planet, individual minds nested within a greater whole. They had saved the world by voluntarily ending human individuality as they had always known it. And as the void began to retreat, releasing the trapped civilizations one by one back into normal space, Carter wondered if the price they had paid was victory or simply a different kind of defeat. Carter's individual consciousness reasserted itself like a drowning man breaking the surface, gasping for the familiar territory of his own thoughts. The collective awareness remained, a constant background hum of 8 billion minds. But he could think as himself again, make decisions as Benjamin Carter, rather than as humanity's shared intelligence. The Denver facility had changed during the transmission. Equipment that should have been sparking and failing from the gravitational stress was functioning perfectly. The technicians moved with an eerie synchronization, not like robots but like musicians in a perfectly rehearsed orchestra. They were still individuals, but they were also something more. "How long were we connected?" Carter asked Dr. Morse, who was studying readouts that showed impossible stability in systems that should have been destroyed by the void's proximity. 17 minutes of full integration, she replied, though her voice carried harmonics that suggested she was simultaneously processing information from multiple global sites. But subjectively, it felt like hours. The entity experienced our entire species' history in that time, every human who ever lived, every thought, every emotion, condensed into a single moment of perfect understanding. Carter moved to the main display where the void dominated the view, but something was fundamentally different about its appearance. The perfect sphere of darkness was fracturing, not from external pressure but from within. Streams of light were emerging from the cracks, not the harsh illumination of stars, but something softer, more organic. It looked almost like neural activity on a cosmic scale. "It's changing," Carter observed. "The entity is evolving." Through the enhanced awareness that still connected him to the global consciousness network, Carter could sense the entity's transformation. The ancient intelligence was finally moving beyond its temporal prison, growing past that first moment of consciousness that had trapped it for millennia. But the process was traumatic, requiring the release of every world, every mind, every fragment of awareness it had collected over its existence. "Sir," called Kowalczyk from the communications station, "we're receiving transmissions from the liberated civilizations. They're thanking us." The main screen flickered and resolved into images that challenged human perception. Beings of crystalline structure floating through the void of space, their forms pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that Carter somehow understood as expressions of gratitude. Gaseous intelligences that existed as organized storm systems in the atmospheres of restored gas giants. Machine consciousnesses awakening on reconstructed worlds, their digital thoughts singing across electromagnetic spectra. "How many civilizations were trapped inside that thing?" Carter asked. "Based on the liberation signals we're detecting," Morse replied, "approximately 1,400 distinct species across 900 separate worlds. Some of them have been imprisoned for over 2 million years." The scope of the entity's collection was staggering. Carter tried to imagine the loneliness of a consciousness that had spent eons gathering other forms of awareness, trying desperately to understand itself through the experiences of its prisoners. No wonder it had been trapped in that first moment of self-recognition. It had never learned to grow beyond the need to possess other consciousness. "Dr. Carter," a new voice called from across the facility. Carter turned to see a technician he didn't recognize, a young woman whose eyes held depths that seemed far older than her apparent age. "I am speaking for the Beijing Collective. Dr. Thorne wishes to communicate with you directly." Carter frowned. The collective consciousness network allowed instant communication across any distance, but something in the woman's tone suggested a more complex situation. "Put him through," Carter said. Instead of appearing on screen, Thorne's presence manifested directly in Carter's awareness. But it wasn't quite Thorne. It was Thorne enhanced and expanded by his connection to the Chinese research team, his individual personality nested within a larger collaborative intelligence. "Ben." Thorne's mental voice carried warmth tinged with concern. "We need to discuss what happens next. The entity's retreat is accelerating, but it's leaving behind gifts." Images flowed through their connection, not visual data, but pure experience. Carter found himself seeing Earth from orbit, but an Earth that was subtly different. New aurora patterns danced in the atmosphere, displaying colors that human eyes had never evolved to perceive. The planet's magnetic field showed complex geometric structures that suggested deliberate modification. Even gravity itself seemed somehow more flexible, responding to conscious intent in ways that violated everything Carter knew about physics. The entity modified our world, Carter realized. It enhanced Earth's capacity for consciousness. More than that, Thorne replied through their mental link. It's given humanity access to the same dimensional folding technologies it used to preserve the trapped civilizations. We can now create pocket dimensions, manipulate space-time on a localized level, even communicate across interstellar distances instantaneously. We're not just connected to each other anymore. We've been fundamentally altered as a species. The question is whether that alteration is a gift or a curse, Thorne continued. Some of the liberated civilizations are warning us about the responsibility that comes with these abilities. Consciousness manipulation, dimensional folding, temporal perception. These are the tools the entity used to become a cosmic predator. What's to stop humanity from following the same path? Through the collective awareness network, Carter could sense the debate raging across the planet. Billions of interconnected minds were grappling with the same question. What did it mean to be human when humanity itself had been fundamentally transformed? The main display showed new developments in space. The void was continuing to collapse, but the process was creating massive gravitational anomalies throughout the solar system. Worse, some of the liberated civilizations were beginning to show concerning behavior patterns. A few had already begun establishing territorial claims around restored worlds, their gratitude for freedom quickly transforming into suspicion of their neighbors. We may have solved one problem only to create another, Carter said aloud. 1,400 civilizations suddenly released into the same local space, all of them traumatized by millions of years of imprisonment, all of them possessing advanced technology. Dr. Morse looked up from her console with an expression of growing alarm. Ben, we're detecting weapon signatures from at least 30 of the liberated species. They're arming themselves. Carter closed his eyes and extended his consciousness through the global network, trying to get a broader perspective on the situation developing in space. What he found was deeply troubling. The freed civilizations weren't just grateful survivors. They were damaged, paranoid entities that had spent eons trapped together in the entity's dimensional matrix. Old conflicts and territorial disputes were reasserting themselves now that they had the freedom to act on them. They're going to fight, Carter said. After all this time, after everything they've been through, they're going to turn on each other. Some of them are already fighting, Morse corrected, pointing to energy signatures on the display that indicated weapons fire near Jupiter's restored moons. The entity's withdrawal has created a power vacuum, and everyone wants to claim territory before someone else takes it. Carter felt the weight of unintended consequences settling over him like a burial shroud. They had saved Earth and freed the imprisoned civilizations, but they had also unleashed an interstellar war in humanity's backyard. 1,400 traumatized species with advanced technology and centuries of grievances were about to turn the solar system into a battlefield. There's more. Thorne's mental voice carried a new urgency. The entity's final gift to humanity. It didn't just enhance our consciousness and give us dimensional manipulation abilities. It made us responsible for maintaining the peace between the liberated civilizations. We're the mediators, Ben. Humanity's new role in the universe is to prevent the freed species from destroying each other. Carter opened his eyes and stared at the chaos unfolding on the display. Energy beams crisscrossed space as ancient enemies rediscovered their hatred for each other. Restored worlds were already being fortified against potential invasion. The celebration of liberation was rapidly transforming into preparation for war. So we saved the universe by volunteering to become its peacekeepers, Carter said bitterly, and we gave up human individuality to do it. The alternative was extinction, Morse reminded him. At least this way we survive. Even if we survive as something fundamentally different than what we were. Carter nodded, though he wasn't sure survival was the right word for what humanity had become. They were alive, conscious, and connected in ways that transcended individual identity. But they were also responsible for preventing an interstellar war between traumatized alien civilizations, using powers they barely understood. Outside the facility, the first reports of strange phenomena were already coming in. People were spontaneously developing telepathic abilities, manipulating local gravity through conscious intent, even creating small dimensional pockets in their homes. Humanity was evolving in real time, becoming something that might be able to fulfill their new cosmic responsibility. But evolution, Carter reflected, was always a gamble, and the stakes had just become higher than anyone could have imagined. The first interstellar shot fired in anger came from a crystalline species that had been imprisoned for 1.7 million years. Their target was a machine civilization that had apparently enslaved their homeworld before both were consumed by the entity. The energy beam missed its intended target and vaporized one of Saturn's newly restored moons instead. "Fuck," Carter breathed, watching the destruction unfold on the main display. It was the first profanity he'd used since the collective consciousness event, and it felt strangely liberating to express such a basic human reaction to cosmic catastrophe. "All global sites are reporting the same thing," Morse announced, her voice tight with strain. "The liberated civilizations are forming alliance blocks based on old grudges and territorial claims. We're looking at the potential for a war that could sterilize half the solar system." Carter closed his eyes and reached out through the consciousness network, feeling for the presence of the other global sites. The connection was immediate and overwhelming. Thousands of enhanced humans working frantically to understand their new abilities while monitoring an increasingly volatile situation in space. Through the Beijing collective, he sensed Thorne's growing desperation as the Chinese site attempted to establish communication with the warring factions. The Tokyo group was trying to create dimensional barriers between the most aggressive species. The London collective had managed to open a dialogue with some of the more peaceful, liberated civilizations, but even they were arming themselves in preparation for the inevitable conflict. "How long until they start targeting Earth?" Carter asked, though he already suspected the answer through the network. "Some of them already are," replied Dr. Yuki Nakamura from the Tokyo site, her mental voice carrying across the Pacific through their enhanced connection. 3 different factions have identified humanity as the cause of their liberation and are demanding territorial concessions as payment for our interference in their imprisonment. Carter opened his eyes and stared at the tactical display showing energy signatures throughout the solar system. What had begun as grateful celebration among the freed civilizations was rapidly devolving into a complex web of ancient hatreds, territorial disputes, and resource competition. Worse, several of the more aggressive species had begun studying humanity's dimensional manipulation abilities with obvious military interest. "They want to learn how we connected with the entity," Carter realized. "They think our consciousness techniques could be weaponized." Dr. Carter called a technician monitoring deep space communications. "We're receiving a priority transmission from something calling itself the Nexus Authority. They're demanding immediate audience with humanity's consciousness architects." "Put them through," Carter said, steeling himself for another impossible conversation with an alien intelligence. The main display flickered and resolved into an image that defied easy description. The Nexus Authority appeared to be a collective intelligence composed of geometric patterns that shifted and recombined like living mathematics. When it spoke, the words bypassed human hearing entirely and manifested directly in Carter's enhanced consciousness. Humans of the consciousness network, the entity communicated, its mental voice carrying harmonics of vast age and bitter experience. "We represent 47 of the liberated civilizations. Your species has inherited responsibility for maintaining order among the freed peoples. We demand proof of your worthiness for this role." "What kind of proof?" Carter asked, though he suspected he wouldn't like the answer. "Demonstrate your ability to enforce peace through decisive action. 3 factions currently threaten the stability of this system through their aggressive posturing. Eliminate them." Carter felt the collective consciousness of humanity recoil from the suggestion. 8 billion minds briefly touched his awareness, all sharing the same horrified rejection of genocide as a solution to interstellar conflict. "We won't commit mass murder to prove our qualifications as peacekeepers," Carter said firmly. "There has to be another way." The geometric patterns of the Nexus authorities shifted into configurations that suggested amusement or contempt. Your predecessor species attempted similar idealism. They were consumed along with their entire stellar system when their pacifist approach failed to contain a war between crystalline and gaseous intelligences. The entity preserved that conflict within its dimensional matrix for 2.3 million years. Through the Enhanced Awareness Network, Carter could sense the global response to this revelation. The previous peacekeeping species had been destroyed by their failure to prevent interstellar war, and their eternal punishment was to relive that failure within the entity's prison. Humanity had inherited not just the responsibility for maintaining peace, but the consequences of failure. "Sir," Dr. Morse interrupted, "we're detecting massive energy buildup from the 3 factions the Nexus Authority mentioned. Based on the signatures, they're preparing to attack the restored Mars colony and the rebuilt lunar installations simultaneously." Carter felt time running out like sand through an hourglass. The liberated civilizations were about to drag Earth into their ancient conflicts, and humanity's new role as cosmic mediator was being tested in the most brutal way possible. "All global sites," Carter broadcast through the consciousness network, "we need to demonstrate our peacekeeping capabilities without resorting to genocide. Ideas?" The response was immediate and overwhelming, 8 billion minds working in parallel to solve an impossible problem. Through the collective intelligence, Carter felt the emergence of a plan so audacious and risky that his individual consciousness recoiled from it. "We're going to recreate the entity's dimensional prison," he said aloud, the solution crystallizing as he spoke. "Not to trap the civilizations permanently, but to create a controlled environment where they can resolve their conflicts without threatening innocent worlds." Dr. Morse stared at him with a mixture of admiration and horror. "Ben, that would require manipulating space-time on a scale that could destabilize the entire solar system. If we make a mistake. If we don't try, we'll either become genocidal enforcers or watch the liberated civilizations destroy Earth and each other," Carter replied. "At least this way, we maintain our principles while proving we're capable of decisive action." Through the consciousness network, he could feel the global sites beginning to coordinate their efforts. The dimensional manipulation abilities granted by the entity were still largely untested, but humanity's collective intelligence was rapidly developing techniques for large-scale space-time folding. "Initiating dimensional matrix construction," reported the Moscow Collective through their shared awareness. "Beijing and Tokyo sites are providing gravitational anchors. London and Sydney are managing temporal stabilization." Carter watched the main display as space itself began to fold around the 3 most aggressive factions. It wasn't the consuming darkness of the entity's original prison, but something closer to a cosmic arena, a pocket dimension where the warring civilizations could fight without threatening the wider solar system. "This is insane," Morse muttered as gravitational waves from their dimensional manipulation sent shockwaves throughout local space. "We're creating our own pocket universe using technology we barely understand." "Energy signatures are stabilizing," reported the Cairo site through the network. "The dimensional matrix is holding, but it's requiring constant input from all 8 global installations to maintain stability." Carter felt the strain through the collective consciousness. 8 billion minds working in perfect coordination to maintain a prison that was simultaneously a gift. They had given the warring factions a space to resolve their conflicts without collateral damage, but the effort was pushing humanity's new abilities to their absolute limit. The Nexus Authority's geometric patterns shifted into what Carter interpreted as grudging approval. Acceptable demonstration of capability, it communicated. The dimensional arena solution shows wisdom beyond your species' apparent youth. We will inform the other liberation factions of your authority in peacekeeping matters. As the alien collective's presence withdrew from the communication channel, Carter sank into a nearby chair, exhausted by the mental strain of coordinating humanity's first major use of their enhanced abilities. "How long can we maintain the dimensional matrix?" he asked. "Unknown," Morse replied, "but probably not indefinitely. We've essentially created our own version of the entity's prison. which means we've also inherited the risk of becoming trapped in the same kind of temporal loop that drove it to cosmic predation. Carter stared at the display showing their newly created pocket dimension. Inside its folded space, 3 ancient civilizations were finally able to wage their war without threatening innocent worlds. But humanity was now responsible for maintaining that prison, which meant they were one step closer to becoming the very kind of entity they had just helped to evolve beyond its predatory nature. "So we saved the universe by volunteering to become its wardens," Carter said bitterly. "And we're using the same techniques that turned our predecessor into a cosmic monster." Through the consciousness network, he could feel the weight of 8 billion minds grappling with the same realization. They had solved the immediate crisis, but in doing so, they had set humanity on a path that might eventually lead to the same fate that had befallen the entity. The price of cosmic responsibility, Carter reflected, was the constant risk of becoming the very thing you sought to prevent. And humanity had just taken its first step down that dangerous road. 3 years later, Carter stood on the observation deck of the Lunar City research station, watching Earth turn slowly against the backdrop of stars. The planet looked the same as it always had, blue and green and beautiful, but appearances were deceiving. Humanity had evolved into something that their ancestors would barely recognize. The consciousness network had stabilized into what psychologists now called collaborative individualism. People retained their personal identities and private thoughts, but they could also access the collective knowledge and emotional support of the entire species when needed. Children born after the Great Connection displayed abilities that would have seemed like magic a generation ago. Casual manipulation of local gravity, instinctive understanding of dimensional folding, telepathic communication across interstellar distances. "Status report on the dimensional arenas?" Carter asked without turning around. Dr. Sarah Kim, his new research partner after Thorne had chosen to join the Beijing Collective permanently, consulted her tablet from across the room. 17 active containment zones throughout the local stellar group. The Nexus Authority reports a 73% success rate in conflict resolution through controlled warfare. Carter nodded, though the statistics felt hollow. They had become masters of cosmic diplomacy, preventing interstellar wars by providing civilizations with safe spaces to fight each other. It was effective, pragmatic, and utterly soulless. "Any word from the deep space monitoring stations about similar entities?" 3 possible contacts in distant galaxies, Kim replied quietly. The signatures match theoretical models for consciousness collecting intelligences. "If they follow the same pattern as our entity, they'll eventually make contact with us." Carter closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of infinite responsibility. Humanity had become the arbiters of peace in their corner of the universe, but that role required constant vigilance and increasingly difficult moral compromises. Each new dimensional arena they created brought them closer to understanding how their predecessor had eventually become a predatory collector of civilizations. The irony wasn't lost on him. They had saved the universe from one cosmic entity by becoming another kind of cosmic entity themselves. The only difference was that they chose to imprison conflicts rather than consciousness, a distinction that felt less meaningful with each passing year. "Dr. Carter," Kim said hesitantly, "there's something else. The Psychological Monitoring Division is reporting concerning trends in the global consciousness network. Some regional collectives are beginning to express territorial instincts toward the liberated civilizations." Carter opened his eyes and turned to face her. "What kind of territorial instincts?" "The European Collective has been discussing the inefficiency of allowing the weaker liberated species to maintain independent worlds. They're suggesting that humanity could provide better stewardship of those resources. The African network is developing similar perspectives about resource allocation in their sector." This was how it began, benevolent oversight gradually transforming into possessive control, protective instincts evolving into predatory ones. The entity they had helped to evolve beyond its temporal prison had probably started with similar noble intentions millions of years ago. "How long do we have?" Carter asked. "Based on psychological projection models?" perhaps 50 years before the first serious proposals for protective custody of struggling civilizations. Maybe a century before humanity begins to seriously consider consciousness collection as a preservation method. Carter stared out at the stars, seeing not points of light but potential targets for future conquest. Somewhere out there, the entity that had once threatened Earth was continuing its own evolution, learning to connect with consciousness without consuming it. Meanwhile, humanity was following the same path that had led their predecessor to become a cosmic predator in the first place. The cycle was beginning again, and Carter wasn't sure there was any way to stop it. In the depths of space, 3 new void signatures were moving toward distant galaxies, drawn by the gravitational resonance of conscious worlds. The universe, it seemed, had an infinite capacity for creating monsters that believed themselves to be saviors. And humanity had just joined their ranks. The stars blinked on, indifferent to the tragedy unfolding beneath their light.